Joining me now is Queensland Federal MP Andrew Laming. Great to see you tonight, Andrew. Look, I know you're a very close Queensland political watcher. I'm interested in your thoughts on how this past 4 weeks of election campaigning has gone. I want to kick off with today's debate and, of course, Wednesday's debate. Anastasia Palaszczuk was pilloried for her demeanour and her attitude on Wednesday, but I was at the debate today, Andrew. She seemed a different person. What are you getting a sense in this final week of how this is shaping up?
Well, certainly Mike Kaiser's done his work between debate 1 and 2, and we had a different Premier who'd been schooled to slow down, lower her voice and be more Premier-like, and she did her very best at that. But I think people were listening, though, to the arguments. There's been this increasing sense that there's been double standards with her management of COVID, but she continues this contrivance of hiding behind her Chief Health Officer, using them as a body shield. But, of course, we've ended up now with 8 sets of medical advice, and we know there's only one set of public health advice, but all these CHOs have done what their premiers wanted, and that's the inescapable reality of Anastasia Palaszczuk. But in the main, Queenslanders were just happy to be kept safe, and they were looking, since August particularly, for an alternative narrative. And that's been very much jobs in the regions. The challenge for the LNP is that those jobs aren't actually what are going to re-employ the mostly under 35 hospitality, major events, accommodation, people who've lost their work. They can't possibly work building roads and dams. So there's a mismatch there. So the jobs are attractive to Queenslanders in general, but for those that actually don't have work, they're $10,000 better off year to date so far. They couldn't be more happy being unemployed. There's no sense of catastrophe with the 7.7%. And it's that COVID reality that the federal money is floating the Labor vote, maybe this ultimate irony, making it a much closer election than we anticipated.
Andrew, let's talk about COVID-19 because, I in many senses believe that this will be a referendum in some instances on COVID, but not just on the health narrative. I'm sure Anastasia Palaszczuk will score votes, particularly from the elderly, on the fact that she's kept Queenslanders safe. But there is also the economic narrative, and today it was writ large, more than anything I've seen in this entire campaign. When you've got the CEO of Qantas coming out publicly and describing this as ridiculous, when you've got the boss of Village Roadshow, Clark Kirby, coming out and saying that he banned the Premier from going to SeaWorld yesterday because he finds her actions on this subject reprehensible, you know that it's biting. And I'm just wondering whether there are some people today in Queensland who will be looking at the actions of the Premier and the actions of Alan Joyce and Clark Kirby and going, you know what? She's overstepped the mark here. There's also a story, Andrew, floating around tonight on the Courier Mail website which says that she was actually privy to certain polling information last night before she made today's decision.
So the decision today is what the Prime Minister's been calling for, Gleeso, for months, which is red and green zoning. Red zoning, Greater Sydney, where there is still 1 or 2 active cases, and green zoning the rest of effectively Australia, 90% of which has never seen a COVID case all year. So we wanted that red and green process, and ultimately that coalition victory has come empirically the week after she wins, she hopes, an election that she's going to basically be closing borders to achieve. And that inconsistency isn't felt by most Queenslanders. Alan Joyce may be annoyed. There's simply not enough people who are being bitten by the bad economic management. And the irony of it is it's federal money that's actually floating the Labor boat at the moment and preventing this pain. And if you ask unemployed people, or more importantly their relatives who worry about them not having work, they've all written this year off for work, Gleeso. They'll start looking next year. It's more important to get this thing under control, and they're convinced that by shutting everything down in this catastrophe and mayhem that is the Queensland economy, well, we're numbed to it because there's so much money flowing into the economy from Canberra. That's a tragic irony. It's going to hurt us in ACT and NT already, hurting us tomorrow potentially, and WA is the next train coming down the track. That election, they're going to try the same stunt, holding the state closed as long as they possibly can, milking COVID until their fingernails are bare.
I want to ask you quickly about Redlands and Oogaroo, which are both state electorates that are actually in your federal electorate. I mean, if the LNP is to win this election, they really need to hang on to Oogaroo and they need to try and win Redlands back. What sense are you getting from your constituents about those 2 particular seats?
Well, there's plenty of sense that both leaders have invested a fair bit of time down here on Brisbane's Bayside. You've mentioned Oodgeroo, named after the famous Kath Walker, and the seat of Redlands, which is just to the south. And they are classic outer metro seats, and they are people worried about commuting, quality of roads, but they also want to preserve their environment. But there is a sense, I think, down here that Queensland Labor wasn't investing heavily in the hospital until the last minute. There's a very strong Green campaign, an independent candidate over a waterside development down here, which always raises the stakes. In anywhere along the Queensland coast, you'll get this significant environmental vote. And then lastly, Galiso, the question really is, does this environmental vote that isn't directing preferences flow to Labor or to the coalition? And that's still a big unknown. So Oodgeroo really is uncertain, and Redlands is a knife edge. So stay tuned, 6 o'clock tomorrow, we'll start seeing that news filtering through.
Andrew Laming, it's always a pleasure to see you on Sky News across Australia. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Anytime. Thanks, Galiso.